happening there to take cues on what is happening in their own workplace. I respectfully point out that this committee does have jurisdiction with regard to workplace safety. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to not only thank you, but assure you that this is the opening salvo. So don't you worry. There's not that many people here today, but those of us that are here, and even many who are not here, are going to stay on this like glue. I have a 22-year-old and an 18-year-old daughter. My 22-year-old daughter is embarking on the very career path now that you young women described at the outset of your careers, and you put fear in my heart for her and my younger daughter. And so I can assure you that elections have consequences, and the reason it's important to elect women to office is so that these kinds of issues get addressed. That having been said, I want to point out the NFL's showcase event is a week away, as the colleagues have mentioned, and these difficult conversations around racism, discrimination, and accountability cannot be pushed to the sidelines. I'd be remiss not to mention the obvious. The NFL has a sexism and a race problem that it refuses to seriously address. Colin Kaepernick, John Gruden, now Brian Flores. The names change, but the problem remains. There is an egregious lack of representation and opportunity for black leaders in the NFL. But my hometown Miami Dolphins are now the catalyst to this conversation over the lack of diversity among football's coaching and executive ranks, and hopefully this will result in reform. This is a common thread, though, and I have a question, Ms. Coburn, of you. And let me just underscore how this represents the expenditure of taxpayer dollars over which we are supposed to jealously guard in this committee. You might be aware that part of the reason that the NFL is such a profitable business is that Congress approved legislation in 1961 that allowed an antitrust exemption where professional football teams to pool together when negotiating radio and television contracts. They also receive lucrative federal tax exemptions and taxpayer dollars in the hundreds of millions to build football stadiums that make them billions. Do you believe Congress should be in the business of protecting an organization that puts the interests of billionaire owners above hundreds of women who experienced harassment and abuse? And do you think that those benefits, that we should consider revoking them if they do not make changes to ensure that you have protections when it comes to human resources, sexual assault, accountability, making sure that there is an equitable and safe workplace for their employees?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. And the NFL recently had a $110 billion media deal, from what I understand. So that amount of money came directly from the exemptions that are in place thanks to you. I think that the oversight of the NFL needs to stand within you because there's no one else doing it. Yeah, the money and power is what rules the NFL. And unless somebody steps in and holds them accountable, nothing will change. They will continue business as usual.
I trust that in the future, Mr. Chairman, we will have far more than 3 minutes apiece, and far more time will be devoted by this committee on the leadership of Chairwoman Maloney to ensure that we hold the NFL accountable and that we help you seek justice. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm with Ms. Wasserman-Schultz. I wish we each had more than 3 minutes to discuss these important issues. I'm grateful to all the witnesses for coming. It's awfully difficult to sit here and listen to the horrific circumstances to which you were subjected. And I want you each to know that I've read each one of your statements. I've also went and read multiple articles about the situation in preparation for this hearing. And I want you to know that I'm really greatly moved by your testimony, and this view what we've heard today is abhorrent and disgusting. And I would also suggest, Mr. Chairman, I know our chairwoman's not here, but this is really an unusual investigation that we're engaged in. I would encourage, Mr. Chairman, that maybe we look at other examples of this workplace environment that is toxic in this way. And I would suggest we bring in Mr. Zucker from CNN, maybe Chris Cuomo, maybe the producers that have problems. I think we need to expand this. And every one of these victim witnesses who testified today, and in their written report, their statements, all of them said that one thing that is important here is to spread this out to try to end this in multiple venues. And I think that's right. And I would just, before I get to my questions, 3 minutes doesn't give you much time. There are four things that are available to a victim right now, and that's administrative procedures, civil procedures, if there's a criminal conduct, and some of these that I read about looked to me like they involved criminal conduct. So there's criminal procedure, and then there's what I would say is happening today, and that's public pressure and public awareness. And so I thank each of the witnesses for being here. Ms. Colburn, it is my understanding that the Washington football team has new priorities to protect the cheerleading team. Some of these measures include better access to human resources, assignment of an HR employee to the cheerleading team, and now it's called the dance team. Is that enough to protect cheerleaders from a toxic workplace culture?
Not when leadership has not changed. And one of the men who was very closely involved with the cheerleaders, their auditions, their calendar pictures, the videos that were created at the behest of that person, no, I don't believe they're safe.
Thank you. I think you're probably right. I wish we had more time. My time has expired. I hope next time, Mr. Chairman, if we're going to engage in this, that we get back to a 5-minute rule at least. And
Sure.
with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs. I would just point out everyone seems to have been fired except the owner in this particular situation. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 3 minutes.
He wasn't here at the beginning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for coming forward today. Your courage and your resiliency have demonstrated so much to so many. Experiencing workplace harassment as young professional women in a male-dominated profession, and to see it go largely unchecked is dispiriting, but coming forward and publicly sharing your stories is cathartic, and I'm confident that your bravery will help countless women and men down the road and usher in an era of greater gender equality. Ms. Coburn, in your op-ed, you mentioned that after the secret Good Bits videos hit the news, that you and 40 or so other cheerleader alumni came together, and some of you were able to mediate a settlement. Were those who settled, were they barred from going to court because of a forced arbitration agreement? Do you know?
Yes, when those videos were uncovered, that's when I came out publicly. I had the strength and courage to organize them, and yes, they got together, and there was mediation, and there was a settlement, and along with that settlement, they were forced to sign NDAs. To be honest, many of them wish they hadn't. They wish they could have spoken out. They were very vocal before the process began, but they also wanted to squash these videos. Their mothers, their daughters, their businesswomen, and they just wanted those videos to go away. So they settled and signed NDAs, but I'd like to remind you, and that's why I'm here, that those videos were created at the behest of the owner, and that is a criminal offense.
Whatever has happened to those videos, have they been destroyed? Has there been any talk about disposition of those videos?
I'm not sure. I've been told by people involved that they were told that they were told to destroy it. I think the Post had copies, but I'm not quite sure where they are. But I have a feeling there's many copies in possession of many of Dan Snyder's friends, if I had to guess, along with other...
So tell me this, Ms. Coburn, the fact that the NFL under Roger Goodell is covering up the report that was issued pursuant to the investigation, how does this help to perpetuate the good old boy network that engages in sexual discrimination, in sexual harassment, in racial discrimination, racial harassment, how does that impact where we are today with the NFL?
It sends
The
quite,
secrecy.
yeah, it sends quite a clear message that money and power can buy anything, and that they can get away with anything, and they did.
Well, I thank you for your courage in coming forward, organizing these women, and I hope that you continue to stick with it. We will stick with you, and we will do what Congress can to make sure that we root out this kind of misconduct and not let it continue to perpetuate. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Now I'd like to recognize the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Spear, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, courageous women, for coming forward. I want to apologize for some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who were first saying thank you for your courage and then victim blaming you. Like somehow you should go to the Human Resources Department that didn't even exist. When you did go to someone superior to you to complain, you were told to shut up and never repeat it. So let's be very clear. Now, there was also this question, what can Congress do about this? Well, Congress can do a lot about this. Next week, all of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who aren't here now could vote for the bill by Sherry Bustos that is going to require that no NDAs can be forced upon employees for sexual harassment or sexual assault. That would go a long way. We could also investigate the tax-exempt status of the National Football League. We gave them that tax-exempt status. Evidently, there was $8 billion received last year that was then divided up among the various teams to the tune of about $250 million a team. Oh, how clever is that? How about if the taxpayers had received that money? Because the NFL isn't doing its job. Roger Goodell has to release the report. There are 120 victims that came forward and testified. The Beth Wilkinson report must be released. And we need to take a real good look at the NFL and determine whether or not it's really eligible for tax-exempt status. Now, let me ask each of you this question. How many times were you sexually harassed when you were working at the Washington Redskins whatever they're called now, Commanders, I guess?
Are you asking
I'm going to start with you, Ms. Coburn.
Too many to count. I was there 14 years, and it's too many to
Is
count.
it more than 100?
It's more than 100.
More than 200?
If I had to guess, yes. These comments, these sexual objectification comments, these uncomfortable situations, I was arm candy at events with all the male executives, like, it was a very constant thing.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson.
At least 50 to 100. And it wasn't even just the comments, it was the situations of being tossed in the air with a skirt on and me having to convince myself, keep your legs closed to avoid an uncomfortable situation in front of the potential client.
All right, Ms. Flores?
over 100?
Ms. Applegate?
I worked there for a year and a half, so mathematically that would be roughly 515 times because it happened on a daily basis, and that was a 7-day-a-week job.
All right, Singleton?
I echo what Emily said. It happened every single day that you were on site. It didn't matter where you were. It was a pervasive culture that happened, and I worked there for 8 years, so multiply that 500 times by 8.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, thank you. This was a predatory environment. I don't believe it's just going on at the Washington Commanders. This is a message to send to every football team in this country. And the criminal conduct that appears to have gone on at the Washington Commanders needs to be fully investigated. That video must be found, and it must be reviewed, and criminal action should be considered by the local district attorney or U.S. attorney. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the witnesses, I was actually in my office listening to your testimony. very intently. What you had to deal with and what you were pressured into doing, what you were coerced into experiencing is abhorrent behavior. It's never tolerated anywhere. It should not be tolerated in any workplace in the United States. And I think that this body, with respect to sexual harassment, has done a lot of work over the years to make it expressly clear to employers that sexual harassment and sexual misconduct is not to be tolerated in the United States. I think that the report in question by the NFL should be released. You know, I'm a fan of the product, but it is clear that there are several issues with the NFL, this being one of them. And I think that that report should be released. I think the other thing that it is important, and you've heard it, you know, obviously from my side of the aisle, is it Congress's purview to quote unquote do something? I don't want to use hyperbole in this instance because what we're discussing is incredibly serious and incredibly sensitive. But Congress also has to be very careful about its role, not just with the Washington Redskins. I still call them the Redskins. I know they changed their name, but to me it's always going to be the Redskins. It's not whether it's with the Washington Redskins or with any corporation in particular. We have a responsibility here of regulating specifically the United States economy when it comes to interstate commerce, to regulating our borders, to actually making sure we coin sound money, that we appropriate for the necessary functions of government. But one of the things that the Constitution of these United States actually precludes us from doing is interfering directly in the affairs of individual businesses, no matter how abhorrent they may be. Now, if there's criminality involved, then that is where the justice system, specifically in this case, the civil system, takes those matters. But I think for my colleagues, no matter how you feel about this issue, and I feel terrible for you and what has happened in the culture at the Washington Redskins, we have to make sure that we don't become the arbiters of deciding how these things are going to be handled inside individual institutions. If there was going to be a committee where these accusations were actually going to be handled, if you want to take a look at what federal law might be, it actually wouldn't be this committee. It would be the committee that meets next door, Judiciary, or maybe Education and Labor, that actually deals with labor practices. And so I really wanted to come down here to express both sides of a very terrible issue. One, the report should be made public. The NFL should absolutely do that. But two, just as well, and this is much more for my colleagues and frankly not for the witnesses, is that we have to be careful about how we wield the power of Congress. Because if Congress decides that they're going to engage themselves in the actions of every business or every community, regardless of whatever our powers actually are under the United States Constitution, then we actually limit the authority of Congress, and we actually undo the authority that we are here to actually wield under the U.S. Constitution.
Thank you. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Krishnamurthy. I would like to thank all our witnesses for being here today. No one should ever have to be employed in a toxic work environment. More importantly, sexual harassment is a behavior that our society has determined is antithetical to a professional work environment. No one should ever have to face that either at work or elsewhere. And I appreciate the courage it took to tell your stories, and I hope you're able to find peace and healing. While I appreciate the opportunity to hear these stories, I would remind the majority that sexual harassment has been illegal for decades and that Congress is not the proper forum for legal relief. We are legislative in nature, and this hearing should be held in a courtroom, not in this committee room. It seems like this committee, the Committee on Oversight and Reform, enjoys holding hearings on issues over which we have no jurisdiction. As I said before, I will say again, this committee used to be named the Committee on Government Oversight and Reform, and when the majority chose to remove government from this committee's title, it should have been a giant red flag that House Democrats believe their authorities go beyond the four corners of the Constitution and the jurisdiction and charter of this committee. This committee needs to refocus its priorities on investigating government operations, not the dealings of private companies and organizations. When private companies or individuals break the law, bringing them to justice is the responsibility of the executive branch. But perhaps that is why this executive branch issue is being highlighted in the legislative branch. This must be a signal to the nation that the executive branch under President Joe Biden is not faithfully enforcing the law as required by Article 2, Section 3 of the Constitution, which says he shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. It must be evident that this is not happening and that the President, through the executive branch, is not faithfully executing the law. Our nation is currently facing record numbers of illegal immigrants crossing our southern border. Inflation is at a 40-year high, tensions are rising with Russia, and we have a real potential of another war in Europe. We have an opioid epidemic where in the last year alone we've had over 100,000 people die of drug overdoses, with the vast majority coming from opioids. Our supply chain continues to have major disruptions, and we have experienced countless other crises spurred on by the current administration's failed policies, and yet we have not held a single hearing to do actual oversight of the federal government, which is the job of this committee, oversight of the executive branch. The mission of this committee is to investigate waste, fraud, and abuse of the federal government, not to investigate the inner dealings of a private entity, regardless of how atrocious. I urge the chairwoman and chairman to concentrate this committee's energy and time to dealing with the many crises our nation is currently facing and no longer abdicate its responsibilities as it has time and time again done this past year. Thank you, and I yield back.
Hold on. Thank you, Mr. Clyde. We're gonna wrap up, but I have a couple questions for you. In June 2018, the NFL announced the findings of its investigations into Carolina Panthers owner Jerry Richardson. The investigation substantiated allegations of workplace sexual harassment and racial discrimination, and the use of non-disclosure agreements, also known as NDAs, to silence former employees. These allegations were revealed only after the victims went public with their stories. Can you put the recommendations that the NFL received? Very good. The NFL's announcement included several recommendations to strengthen its protection of workers in teams across the league. This is back in 2018. One recommendation was, quote, a specific prohibition of using NDAs to limit reporting of potential violations or cooperation in league investigations under the personal conduct policy. Ms. Engelson, you left the Washington football team in 2019 after the NFL issued its recommendations. Were you aware of a requirement that misconduct in the workplace should be reported to the NFL?
No, I was not.
Ms. Nunes, you also left the Washington football team that same year in 2019, so after the recommendations were made, after the Carolina Panthers investigation. When you left the team, were you asked to sign an NDA?
To my knowledge, I signed release papers.
Another recommendation was, quote, a specific requirement that claims of workplace misconduct issues be reported to the league office under the personal conduct policy. Ms. Engelson, were you aware of this policy?
No, I was not aware of this policy. It was not disseminated at all in the Washington football team.
Finally, the NFL was recommended to, and I quote, establish a hotline or other system to allow league and club employees to report issues of workplace misconduct on a confidential basis. Ms. Nunes, were you aware of such a hotline or system to report issues of workplace conduct on a confidential basis?
I was not.
So this has been a past issue and it's a current issue. It is no surprise that you were not aware of these reporting mechanisms because it appears that the NFL failed to implement them. 3 years later, history is already repeating itself. After the NFL's investigation of WFT, the NFL stated that it would implement, and I quote, a requirement that all club employees have the ability anonymously to report issues of workplace conduct to their club or the NFL. The NFL holds itself to a higher standard, yet it has repeatedly shirked its responsibility to keep workers safe. It is up to Congress to get to the bottom of why. Let me just repeat. The NFL released reports on Ray Rice, The Carolina Panthers, Deflategate, but nothing with regard to the Washington football team sexual harassment scandal. Now, I just want to make a few final comments here. Some of my colleagues have repeatedly acknowledged your pain. They've said that you have suffered horrific harm. But unfortunately, they say that workplace misconduct in this committee being examined is a big waste of time. That the issue of sexual harassment in one of the most prominent workplaces in this country and a cover-up on behalf of a powerful owner is simply not worth congressional oversight is absolutely wrong. The issue of sexual harassment is absolutely within the purview of this committee. And I'm so grateful for you coming here and sharing your stories again. And it's very painful. Obviously, you've provided very emotional testimony, and many of us were moved to just hearing it. I want to just say finally, today we've heard repeatedly of sexual harassment, not just from employees, not just from middle management, but we've heard about sexual harassment by Dan Snyder, the team owner himself. And anyone who saw the Washington Commanders announcement of the team name yesterday saw that he was part of the decision-making with regard to that particular issue as well. He is front and center in the decision-making of that team, even today, despite having presided over pervasive sexual harassment and committed sexual harassment against Ms. Johnston and others himself. Ms. Johnston shared how Dan Snyder himself sexually touched her without her consent at a work dinner and then tried to push her into his limo. Ms. Coburn told us how Dan Snyder ogled at cheerleaders through binoculars during auditions and used women as, quote, sex objects and tools to increase sales. Ms. Applegate's boss told her not to wear flats because he, quote, liked the way her body looked better in high heels. Ms. Engelson's harasser humiliated her regularly at marketing meetings. Ms. Nunes' older colleague texted her suggestively about the, quote, things he would do to her. I'm so sorry you endured all this. And that's just a sampling of the outrageous behavior we heard today. And when these women reported their harassment time and again, they were almost always ignored or told to just shut up. In fact, there was no functional HR department and no system for reporting sexual harassment at WFT. And as Ms. Engelson told you, when the team finally hired executives who tried to protect employees from harassment, those executives were quickly fired. Neither the WFT nor the NFL ever did anything to protect these women, despite NFL supposedly holding itself to a, quote, higher standard. And that's why we stepped in, to protect these victims, to protect victims all across the country, and to hold the rich and powerful accountable. And as I said earlier, today is the beginning, not the end. Today is when we start holding WFT and NFL accountable for the harassment, accountable for the cover-ups. The buck stops here. Okay, we have one last person who just showed up for questions. Ms. Tlaib, are you there? Ms. Tlaib? I'm not sure if she can hear me or perhaps she's not here. Okay. Well, I just want to. This is a bipartisan issue, the investigation of sports. In 2005, Republican Chairman Tom Davis of this committee, joined by Democrats, subpoenaed Major League Baseball about its steroid safety policy. 10 years ago, Democrats and Republicans on this committee again worked together to demand that the NFL test its players for steroids. In 2012, then Chairman Issa held a hearing on this issue, stating that the NFL's failure to safeguard its players' health regarding steroids was not just an issue affecting the league, it, quote, endangers young athletes who admire and often try to emulate them. And let me just emphasize that our sons, our daughters, everybody, they're watching what the NFL does, and they take their cues from the NFL, and they take their cues from how the league treats misconduct that happens in the NFL. The NFL has an enormous platform. When necessary to inform potential legislation, Democrats and Republicans work together, and that's what I hope we will do once again with regard to sexual harassment in the workplace. The failure to do so far has endangered women across the NFL and sent a powerful message to every workplace that accountability is not mandatory, but it's optional. I ask my Republican colleagues to join in demanding that the NFL do better. With that, I want to thank the participants again for your bravery and courage in coming forward today. And I commit to you that today is the beginning, not the end. And with that, this roundtable briefing is adjourned.